Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started here momentarily, give folks the opportunity to log in. Welcome to all of you who have joined us. We are going to get started here in just about another minute or so. I want to give folks the opportunity to log in. All right, good afternoon, and thank you again for joining us today. We are so excited to have you here. Before we begin, I'd like to note that the views expressed in written conference materials or publications and by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsements by the U.S. government. Next slide, please. My name is Mackenzie Simmons, and I have the privilege of serving as the project manager for SAMHSA's 988 Crisis Systems Response Training and Technical Assistance Center that's operated by Altarum. Now, let's take a moment to ensure that everyone in the audience is ready and comfortable with the technical aspects of the webinar. As you can see, we have ASL interpreters joining us today and have closed captioning enabled as well. If you need tech support, please reach out by utilizing the Q&A function and we'll address it for you. Lastly, if you have questions for presenters during the presentation, please enter them into the Q&A area and we'll address them as time allows after the presentations or during office hours. As a reminder, we will be hosting office hours immediately following the conclusion of today's webinar from 2:30 to 3. That's Eastern Standard Time for those of you who aren't on that time zone. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is the sixth and final session in a series of webinars called Connecting to Serve, Promising Practices for 988 and 911 Collaboration. This session will focus on understanding the components of risk, liability, and the interoperability of 988 and 911. After attending the webinar, attendees should be able to review and comprehend standard operating definitions of several key terms such as risk, liability, and qualified immunity, explore barriers and considerations that assisted in developing 988 and 911 interoperability, and provide a working knowledge of navigating conversations surrounding risk and liability as it pertains to 988 and 911. Next slide, please. Before we start our presentation portion, I'd like to introduce Tiffany Russell. Tiffany serves as the Chief of Crisis and Justice Initiatives with SAMHSA's 988 in Behavioral Health Crisis Coordinating Office, is an advisor to the 988 director and other members of SAMHSA's senior leadership in planning, determining policy, programs, and activities that address complex challenges in coordination of 988 crisis centers with law enforcement, 911 call centers, and emergency medical service providers. She also develops, recommends, and implements programs and provisions of guidance related to improving crisis response and equitable access to services for individuals with behavioral health needs that minimize unnecessary law enforcement involvement and promotes diversion from the justice system. At this time, I will hand things over to her for a brief welcome and to introduce our guest speakers.
Thanks so much, Mackenzie, and good afternoon, everyone. We are so excited to have you join us and thrilled to have your participation. Before we move on to introducing our speakers, I want to thank SAMHSA's leadership for the continued support of this initiative and the ongoing work to transform the behavioral health crisis system. Thank you to Assistant Secretary Dr. Miriam Delphin-Rittman and her executive leadership team, Director of 988 and Behavioral Health Crisis Coordinating Office, Monica Johnson, Deputy Director John Palmieri, Senior Advisor Richard McKeon, and Division Directors James Wright, and specifically my Division Director Jill Mays for her unwavering support and for also naming this webinar series, as well as each member of the 988 team. Thank you to Vibrant Emotional Health, NHTSA, and the National 911 Office, specifically Kate Elkins, for their partnership in developing this series. I also want to recognize the Alterum team, Mackenzie, Sharon, Diane, Callie, and Olivia, for their professionalism and support in producing this series. This has been the greatest group project that I have been a part of and could not have done this series without them. The two-part episodes on risk and liability have been our most requested subject related to 988 and 911 interoperability. We wanted to ensure that we provided sufficient coverage on the foundation of this topic, federal and state level implications, and real-life application. Today's episode will focus on real-life application, as well as the challenges and opportunities that take place when collaborating with community partners on alternative responses. We are so honored to have our federal partners from the Department of Justice to share more on the civil rights implications with developing alternative response for behavioral health crises. It is our hope that the information you receive from all of the episodes in the Connecting to Serve series will encourage deeper engagement and confidence in working through the intricacies of 988 and 911 collaboration. Finally, the 988 Behavioral Health Crisis Coordinating Office is committed to not only providing information through this webinar series and one-on-one technical assistance through our Crisis Response Technical Assistance Center, but also through additional guidance documents and toolkits currently in development. We want to thank you in advance for your patience and know that we are working diligently to provide you with resources to supplement you in this work. Now let's get to the introductions of our speakers for today. First, we have Jennifer Mathis, who is a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the U.S. Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. Prior to arriving at DOJ, Jennifer served as the Director of Policy and Legal Advocacy at the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, a national nonprofit legal advocacy agency that organizes the rights of people with mental disabilities. Throughout the course of her career, Jennifer has used litigation as well as legislative and administrative policy advocacy to promote equal opportunity for people with disabilities in all areas of life, including community living, healthcare, housing, employment, education, parental and family rights, voting, and other areas. Jennifer also played a key role in coordinating strategy and briefing when the Olmstead case was heard before the Supreme Court and has litigated numerous community integration cases before and after. We also have joining us today Amanda Stamps, who is retired from the Mesa Police Department after spending almost 24 years pursuing her passion of helping others. Detective Stamps specializes not only in practical training options, but also working with communities to create the appropriate crisis system to match their needs. Detective Stamps continues to teach and train on various topics and facilitates numerous crisis intervention team training across Arizona. They are also the first full-time CIT program coordinator for the Mesa Police Department and was involved in the creation of the crisis response team, the current co-responder model, and the call diversion program responsible for diverting hundreds of calls directly to the crisis system. They have also assisted numerous regions in the creations of CIT programs. Next, we have Anthony Pulse, who is an attorney and former police officer. Mr. Pulse is a former prosecutor for the Lake County State's Attorney Office in Illinois, as well as the co-author of the Illinois and Arizona Officers Legal Source books, and provides legal analysis for both. They are also a former police legal advisor for the Mesa, Arizona Police Department, a former deputy county attorney assigned as a public safety liaison for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office in Phoenix, Arizona, and is currently an assistant city attorney for the city of Goodyear, Arizona, and assigned as the public safety legal advisor. Wrapping up our speakers for today is Matthew Moody, who serves as the founder of Moody Consulting Group, focused on helping law enforcement and municipalities with how they provide help to those with mental health issues. In his prior role, he oversaw over 100 employees in a crisis contact center that fielded over 40,000 calls and 6,000 dispatches per month. He has over 15 years of experience in the behavioral health field, specializing in police collaboration, 988, and crisis mobile teams. Matthew has also assisted in creating 7 911 diversion programs and helped other police departments in Phoenix, Mesa, Tucson, Oklahoma, and Calgary, among others. Collectively, these programs have diverted over 2,000 calls per month from 911 centers to 988 centers. Matthew also serves as the president of Board of Directors for Mental Health America of Arizona and on the CIT Review Board for the Phoenix Police. And with that, I'll pass things over to Jennifer to get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Tiffany. Happy to be here today, and I am going to talk about the different lens than many folks have been thinking about it, and that is through the lens of civil rights, and specifically disability rights law. This lens is important for people involved with emergency response systems to understand, because there are some key relevant legal obligations at play. So people with significant psychiatric disabilities or mental health disabilities are generally protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, because a person with a disability is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity like thinking, concentrating, sleeping, interacting with others, or other activities. And if they're covered certain rights not to be discriminated against, that means they have a right to equal opportunity to benefit from public service systems, including emergency response systems. So in a nutshell, if other people who are the subject of emergency calls that call for a health response and receive a health response, but people with psychiatric disabilities who are the subject of those calls typically receive a police response, including when there is no need for a police response, often with tragic results, then that is typically not equal treatment. So I want to talk today about 3 findings letters that touch on these issues that were issued by the Justice Department Civil Rights Division in the last couple of years. All of those involve policing systems, and the bulk of the findings concern constitutional policing, excessive use of force, discrimination based on race, and a number of other issues. But one issue that I want to talk about that is common to all of those reports is the issue of the ADA and the treatment of people with behavioral health disabilities. So in March of 2023, the Justice Department announced the results of its investigation into whether the Louisville Metro government and the Louisville Metro Police Department engage in a pattern or practice of violations of the Constitution and federal law. As I noted, most of the report focused on findings about excessive use of force, illegal stops, other issues, but we also found that the city and its police department had discriminated against people with mental health disabilities in violation of the ADA when responding to them in crisis. So the report concluded that under the ADA, the city had an obligation to afford people with disabilities, including behavioral health disabilities, an opportunity to participate in or benefit from their services that is equal to that afforded to others, and is as effective in affording equal opportunity to obtain the same result. That includes the city's system for responding to 911 calls and the police department's responses to those calls. In responding to such calls for people who are experiencing physical health crises, the report found the city provides a prompt and often life-saving medical response by trained EMTs. But when the calls involve people experiencing mental health episodes, Louisville police officers were the primary and generally the sole responders, even where safety did not require a law enforcement response. So many of the incidents we've reviewed could be safely and more effectively resolved through a response by behavioral health professionals, such as a mobile crisis team, or with co-responding behavioral health professionals, along with appropriately selected and trained officers. We found this unequal treatment violates the ADA. Give you a little bit of facts. According to a study commissioned by Louisville Metro, police officers responded to over 55 behavioral health related dispatches per day based on calls to the 911 communications center recorded as behavioral health related. So we actually believe the number is significantly higher. Many of these calls involve no violence, no weapon, no threat of harm that would have warranted a police response. Rather, they often involve calls about a person with suicidal thoughts, but no immediate plan, a person experiencing delusional thinking or responding to hallucinations, or somebody who was loitering. A law enforcement response may have been necessary for some calls involving violence or threats of violence. We found that thousands of calls per year could be safely and more effectively resolved through a response by behavioral health professionals. Again, a mobile crisis team, co-response, etc. So we found further that unnecessary police responses to people with behavioral health disabilities were often ineffective and harmful, and that officers often failed to use standard tactics to de-escalate people in crisis, and that officers' actions led to avoidable uses of force and arrests. In many cases, they also led to avoidable hospitalizations. There are some dramatic examples in the report. I won't go through them, but I will just say we also found that Louisville Metro could make reasonable modifications, reasonable changes to avoid the unequal treatment of people with behavioral health disabilities, including, for example, deploying an alternative behavioral health-led response, including expanding their alternative response options and modifying the 911 call center's policies, enhancing coordination with the crisis hotline and other services because the hotline didn't have an association with mobile crisis response, and modifying Louisville Metro Police Department CIT program. So those were some of the recommendations in the report. The report recommended the city expand the reach and capacity of its mobile crisis team pilot program and transition to a behavioral health-led response to people experiencing behavioral health crisis, that the city modify its dispatch procedures to deploy mobile crisis and co-responder teams when appropriate, and that an improved coordination, as I said, with the crisis hotline when a police presence is needed, that it deploys officers who are equipped to respond with to behavioral health related issues. And we have been negotiating a consent decree with Louisville in an effort to resolve those findings. Next, I'm going to talk about Minneapolis. In June of 2023, the Justice Department issued similar findings concerning the city of Minneapolis and its police department, found that the Minneapolis Police Department responded to well over a million emergency and non-emergency 911 calls between January of 2016 and August of 2022. And almost 10% of the calls directly related to a behavioral health issue. For the vast majority, the police were the primary, if not the sole responder, mostly due to the unavailability of behavioral health response. For the vast majority of behavioral health related 911 calls to which the police responded, the person in need of behavioral health attention was not reported to have a weapon or pose an immediate threat to themselves or others. only less than 0.5% of over 100,000 mental health calls resulted in an arrest on the scene, underscoring that most of the routine reliance on police responses to these calls seems unwarranted. As in Louisville, we found that police had inadequate and inaccurate training to handle mental health crises, that they often failed to use appropriate de-escalation techniques, and that in many cases they used force when it could have been avoided. While the city had launched a behavioral health crisis pilot program in December of 2021, we found it lacked the capacity to respond to many calls for which it was needed. Also, as in Louisville, we found that the disparity in treatment of calls involving people with mental health disabilities compared to calls involving other types of medical assistance violated the ADA. We're also negotiating a consent decree with Minneapolis that would require modifications to the response to mental health crises, including expanding and improving the city's behavioral health crisis response program. And then lastly, I will just say a little bit about Phoenix. In June of this year, we issued a findings report concerning the Phoenix Police Department. Like the findings in Louisville and Minneapolis, the Phoenix findings included an ADA section concerning responses to emergency calls concerning people with behavioral health disabilities. And we found that most 911 calls involving people with behavioral health issues were dispatched to police. A 2016 community needs assessment on crisis response found that over half of people with mental health issues surveyed had at least one encounter with the police, and 24% had 3 or more interactions with the police. A 2021 study commissioned by Phoenix found that 10% of the dispatched 911 calls for service related to behavioral health, and officers spent nearly 11% of their time on quote unquote check welfare calls between 2016 and March of 2022. So Phoenix has done a number of things to develop mobile crisis capacity. They've developed a partnership with a nonprofit called Solari that operates a crisis line, can send mobile crisis responses. They embedded a clinician from Solari to work part-time in the 911 call center. And the city also invested $15 million to expand the fire department's community assistance program, which included creating behavioral health units that can respond to behavioral health calls for service. Currently, there are 4 of those operating 20 hours a day citywide, and 911 call takers have begun sending some of those calls to behavioral health units. Nonetheless, the report found that 911 call takers do not consistently and adequately identify, consider, or communicate behavioral health issues when answering 911 calls, which can still result in unnecessarily sending the police. The report found that even when callers specifically ask for mental health crisis help, call takers have often sent officers without communicating the caller's concern. There's an example of a motel desk clerk calling for 911 about a man with quote unquote some mental issues who was quote unquote not a threat or anything, but roaming around the property, crawling on the ground, saying, "I'm looking for my mom." And the call taker coded the call as trespassing and sent officers to respond. And in the call notes, the call taker wrote, subject said he was looking for his mom, possible CIT situation, but gave no officers no further information about the man's behavior or the caller's concern. And essentially the officers arrived and just said, "Let's go, you don't belong here," walked around him until he left the property, and the man got no help. Their person was not in danger, was not inappropriately arrested or injured, but got no help of the type for which the call was placed to try to get him help. And so those are, in a nutshell, the kinds of issues that these 3 reports address. We found violations of the ADA in all of these reports. There was also a guidance document that was issued in 2023 by the Justice Department, as well as the HHS, Department of Health and Human Services. You could find it online. It's called guidance for emergency responses to people with behavioral health or other disabilities. This was part of an executive order around policing issues. And the guidance says many of the things that are said in these findings reports, but lays out some good practices and what the ADA would expect of emergency response systems in these situations. And I would say the lesson of our findings in Louisville, Minneapolis, and Phoenix is that in many jurisdictions, call centers that dispatch emergency responses can make reasonable modifications, reasonable changes to their usual practices that would afford equal opportunity to people with disabilities, including by sending a mobile crisis team or other responder rather than law enforcement in appropriate circumstances when a call involves a person with a mental health disability and there's not a need for a law enforcement response. Where a police response is called for, dispatching a co-responder team that includes a police officer and a mental health specialist may be a reasonable modification. And law enforcement agencies can also make reasonable modifications to their usual practices by arranging for a mobile crisis team or other responder to come to the scene where a law enforcement response is not necessary. The key point is that jurisdictions should not assume that the proper response to a mental health related call is always to send law enforcement, but should assess reasonable modifications to their usual practices, modifications that are feasible and appropriate to afford equal opportunity to people with disabilities. In addition, I would just highlight the role of the state. We also have a couple of investigations that look at states' roles. In 2022, we announced investigations of Kentucky and Oklahoma to determine whether those states are providing sufficient community-based services to prevent unnecessary institutionalization, causing adults with mental health disabilities to experience repeated institutionalization and law enforcement encounters. Those state investigations go hand in hand with the local investigations of emergency response systems, and just show it's important not only to ensure the coordination of crisis responses where appropriate, but also to ensure that the community services, both crisis services and also longer term services that are financed by the state and administered, provided by the state, that are necessary to prevent crises and hospitalizations are actually available. And I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the next person. And I am hopeful that I can keep online. If I disappear, I will be right back because my system is having some issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We appreciate you working through your presentation, even though you were having some network issues. Now we're going to move over to our collaboration presentation with Amanda Stamps, Anthony Pulse, and Matthew Moody.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. First of all, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. I personally have been involved in this world for about 20 years. The first part was solely in police training. I am going to speak about the project we have in Mesa, Arizona, and talk in chronological order. Matthew and Tony were also very much involved in this project. I do also want to shout out the original person who started this project in Mesa, Arizona. She goes by CPY, and she was a communications supervisor at the time. So CPY and I connected in about 2017. I was attached to our crisis response team, and I was looking at calls for service, mental health calls for service, because obviously we were developing programs in Mesa in hopes of decreasing these calls for service. What we knew were that we had an extremely large amount of calls involving people with mental health crisis, individuals who were suicidal, and our officers, while they have training, we have a CIT program in Mesa, we saw the calls routinely just continue to go up year after year after year. We created a crisis response team with dedicated detectives that responded out to some of these calls and worked with our high needs individuals. We added a co-responder eventually. We doubled our CIT training and program. But what we were finding was that we had a decrease in use of force, but our calls were not going down. And just to give you reference in Mesa is about 500,000 large. We have about 800 officers, and back then we were averaging about 300,000 calls a year, just to put it in perspective for everybody. So I found out when I was asking CPY for this information, I found out that she was looking at alternative responses through communications. So we started to work together on this project. The most interesting thing about the project was that there was resistance pretty much from everybody. We started looking at this about 10 years before it actually launched off, so just to let you guys know. Legally speaking, there were some questions. There were questions from officers. And quite frankly, there were a lot of questions from our communications personnel. And if you work in communications, you might have some of these same feelings. There were concerns about losing control and not being able to help people appropriately. So we had to tackle this problem from all perspectives. So the first one we looked at was, what is the alternative? What can we do? And interestingly enough, in law enforcement, what we always say is there's two things we don't like: change and when change doesn't happen. So we do that quite frequently. So when we started talking about this, a lot of the concerns were safety. You know, what does the safety look like? How do we send people without guns out to these calls? So we really had to take a deep dive into what that looks like. Historically speaking, people in crisis are not violent. Historically speaking, people with mental health conditions are not violent. What we see in law enforcement more so is that power struggle with authority that happens when we show up. It's not necessarily the mental health part of it. So we had to get out of our own way in this, because as law enforcement, we want to be the ones to take the chances on these calls. So I connected with, at the time it was CRN, now it is Solari, to ask them, what does that look like for you all? What do you guys go to? And that's what I told our leadership. We have to stop assuming what they feel okay doing and just ask them instead of putting our thought process into what they are doing. And we found out that they are very equipped to go to almost anything. And they have a track record for it. Matthew will probably speak to the numbers, but they have a very safe track record for all types of crisis calls. So once we jump past that, we had to talk about liability. And I won't talk too much about this because Tony's going to speak on it. But I am grateful because for the most part, the answers that we routinely got about liability was, that's how we've always done it. And what would happen if we didn't go? And I will tell you, we had learned that generally speaking, we were struggling with what happens when we go, not when we don't go. So we had to look at it from a different side. And I'm super grateful because Tony was one of the first attorneys with our city that was open to answer that question, that was open to look at case law. Interestingly enough, Tony did come back to me because in my head, once we talked about the safety issues and what the crisis teams were willing to do, I thought it was a done deal. Like, what do we have to do? You know, that it's just common sense. These should be going over to mental health professionals where they can get the services they need. So Tony called me out, and he said that we had to structure it in a way that the triages were done appropriately. So we started researching what that looked like. We started researching suicide triage, and came up with a Colombian suicide scale. So we started looking at that, and then our policies and how to redirect the policies and what that looked like. And I would tell you initially it was baby steps. You know, we took baby steps with everything, what type of calls we were. We would go out on danger to self or other suicidal calls, but it was only if they were kind of having a bad day. At no point in time, if they had plans, would we divert that in the beginning. We had to kind of grow into that comfort. And then we also had to train. Jennifer spoke about training. We had to train our communication staff to recognize it. And we got the most training from embedding a clinician in our communications center to learn what that looks like. Our communications people had already had training in identifying mental health crisis and what it looks like. But they needed to know what that looked like from a crisis line perspective and what would happen if crisis lines took over. So we implemented training and they sat in our communications for hours during out the week to hear the calls, to direct our people, to learn how to work in training with us. And gradually we just got to a point where they were way more comfortable in the type of calls that were diverted. So I will tell you that in law enforcement, once the change starts to flow, it does flow. It just takes a little bit. It's always kind of that slow process. But about 6 months into the process, we started to notice the numbers going up more. There was more comfort level from our communications people. And I would get phone calls at times from my patrol officers just simply saying, okay, shouldn't this have gone over to crisis? So our officers were starting to see the calls that were necessary to go over to crisis. I probably should clarify that here in Maricopa County, we have a robust crisis system. So when we send things to crisis, we have access to crisis mobile teams that are embedded in our areas. We also have 24-hour drop-off observation units throughout our county. We have 4 that are running 24/7, one of which it is in the city of Mesa. So we have the opportunity to have a great relationship with all things crisis within our county. That has existed here for a good 20 years. So over the years, and you will see this data in the end, we officially launched in, I'm pretty sure Matthew, correct me if I'm wrong, we officially launched in 18, but we really started collecting data in 2019 is when we really started looking at the data. In 2019, we did not have the embedded clinician from Solari working with us. And you will see the numbers. You will see the numbers start to go up when Matthew shows them at the end. 2020, 2021, they kept going up. And that is when we embedded the clinician. The numbers really started to increase because again, it's that comfort level. I will also tell you that here in Arizona, we are lucky that we have legislation that pushes in this direction as well. In our statute for mental health with law enforcement officers, there's a specific part that talks about qualified immunity, and it specifically says, you know, the language, I don't have it in front of me, but the language says that they want us to take our time, that it's more important to figure out what's going on and take our time. And it kind of takes the liability out of rushing into things. So that is helpful. And then our state had established case law for qualified immunity for our communications personnel as well. So we have case law for that in Arizona. So when you talk about the liabilities, that we had that on our side. The case law for communications came about 2 or 3 years after we started. And I won't talk about case law too much, but that helped our process and just continued to increase how much we could use this and direct people to it. So when you look at our calls for service, that's 2016 to this last year. So to put it in perspective, 2016, 17, 18, we had doubled our crisis intervention team training attendees, or quadrupled. It was a giant increase in 2016. We had created our crisis response team, now known as our mental health support unit. So we had done that. We had created a program called the Residence Assistance Program, which allowed people to self-identify to us prior to our arrival, so we would know about it. We'll talk a little bit about confidentiality, but I will tell you that in our populations, that program did not take off. There were not a lot of people that were willing to give their personal information to law enforcement, to a municipal government entity. But there were some that did that. So all of those things started 2015, 16, maybe latest in 17. If you look at those numbers, they continue to rise despite all of the extra stuff that we were doing. And in law enforcement, we have a tendency to see a problem and throw ourselves into the solution. because that's what we've always done. That's the expectation. If there's a community-based problem, we find a solution to it as law enforcement within our own police departments. And while we did have that decrease in use of force, we had that absolutely. What we're seeing is people were still falling through the cracks. I can send a well-trained law enforcement officer out to a call, but they're still just a well-trained law enforcement officer. They are not a mental health professional. So when it comes to looking at the individual's condition and thinking about treatment options, we are super limited on what we can do. So you're always going to see this high numbers and the increase of the calls because the officers do not have the bandwidth nor the knowledge to help people long term. And I feel like that is probably the greatest win of creating the diversion program is to start getting people the help they need. And these calls decrease because our repeat callers are not our repeat callers anymore. They get the services they need. They get into long-term treatment. They have people who will follow up with them on a routine basis. We even did that a little bit as our co-responder model, but quite frankly, one counselor for the entire city of Mesa of 500,000 people could only manage so much. So that is when these numbers finally start to decrease. And finally going into 2023, those numbers just warm my heart because I really wanted to see the decrease happening. We all know that a lot of mental health concerns and issues came after 2020, so that did spike back up a little bit, but luckily we are trending down. And with 988 coming, we're hoping we can kind of push that education towards that because this is essentially a long version of getting to 988, right? It's helping people make the decision to go to 988 versus using police services. So when we see the numbers, you really can't discount what it does. I will say legally and liability speaking, I don't know that there has been any issues that have come up over the last 5 to 6 years, and we are grateful for that. I now work in the private sector, so I get to see how this works and how this is working to improve the relationships and how the crisis system has had to somewhat pick it up to manage some of the numbers because that is a reality of it. When we have more of this, we're probably going to need more crisis mobile teams. So it pushes it to the right direction of how we get people help, you know, and how everybody in the end gets what they need. Law enforcement is understaffed, we know that. So the decrease of calls that they're not needed for is always a win for law enforcement. And quite frankly, as a law enforcement officer, I will tell you that crisis calls are frustrating because you do not have the time nor the skill set to help people in the manner that they need. So to be able to turn it over to somebody that will actually get them the help they need is a win for us. And we just have to kind of learn to let go of some of our control issues over the years. But it is a win, and officers do like this. They are happy that they are getting the help they need. And they are happy that it kind of relieves the frustration on that side. And there is not a family out there that doesn't appreciate the call diversion because they know that their loved one, when they call, even if they choose to call 911, if they're diverted appropriately, they will receive the services they need. So I will stop on my end. I will toss the ball to my counterpart, Tony Post, to kind of have him discuss it from his perspective.
Well, thanks, Amanda. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here and be a part of this organization and part of this webinar. So I'm going to be able to talk a little bit here about some liability issues, qualified immunity, a little bit of the risk things involved with this at a pretty high level, because I realize we have a national audience here. So we obviously have different federal circuit courts of appeals. We have different case law depending on where you're at. So I'm just going to talk about it pretty generally and kind of give you my experience in helping Mesa implement this and dealing with Amanda as we were going through this process. So I guess the first thing I should start off by saying is bringing a lawyer in from the beginning is going to be something. As you implement this, you absolutely need to do that. You need to get out in front of that. And, you know, I hate to say it needs to be a competent lawyer, but not every lawyer can do public safety. Not every lawyer can do this type of work, because it certainly is very involved. And also you need to have an understanding of a lot of the different areas that this touches. And quite frankly, this area with mental health touches almost everything in your city or your village, or wherever you're policing at. And legally speaking, there's a lot of pitfalls and traps that you have to prepare for. So my essential thought process, I'm going through this, and when I was talking with Amanda initially, is what is legally defensible? And that seems to be, that has served me well. And that is also seems to be a good approach to doing this, because there is no way you're going to be able to consistently, I guess, consistently anticipate what plaintiffs' lawyers are going to do if and when you get sued. That is something that is specific to every case, obviously. And to turn around and look at the established case law in your state, in your federal circuit of appeals, is certainly something you need to be up on, because that's going to guide your approach on how you kind of steer yourself into getting into this. So, couple things, I guess, at the outset. Number one, when Amanda was saying that this received some pushback, that is 100% the truth. This, and obviously it was 10 years ago, and there was, this wasn't out in front, but the need that was recognized is that we are sending police officers with little to no legal authority, depending on the circumstance they're at, to go do something in this situation. Somebody's not, you know, feeling good about themselves in that particular day. Well, it's not exactly an emergency type of situation, but it's not exactly an exigent type of situation either. So law enforcement was kind of stuck in this kind of limbo area with not a lot of authority, and being forced to make some decisions that that unfortunately sometimes turned out to have tragic consequences in the end. But also there are some success stories in there. So we were trying to look at what would be the best way to kind of expand our ability to have time to decide what was going on and what can we do to get these people help as quickly as possible. Because obviously for you lawyers in the room, the best fight is the one you don't have to have. So if there's no government action, that certainly changes the game here a little bit. And that is something that, you know, when I was at Mesa and we were looking into this, that was very attractive to us, because we said, hey, we got a third party coming out and they're going to go do this. And the police officers might be on scene, but they might be a distance away. They might be actually there, but there's no state action. There's no Fourth Amendment issue. And that really was kind of like the tipping point on a lot of this stuff. And once that training got out, it turned out to work itself out pretty well. So happy about that. And it turned out to work itself out very well. But one of the things I want to bring up as we go through, you know, my time here, getting everybody on board up front about what you want to do is huge. Mesa is lucky in the sense that it is a major metropolitan city. You know, Phoenix, I believe, is the 5th largest city in the United States. I think Mesa somewhere in the 30 to 40th range. They have a lot of resources. A vast majority of police agencies in the United States are not as large as Mesa. And they're sharing resources, they're sharing dispatch centers, they're sharing jails, they're doing all kinds of different stuff. So that is something that needs to be taken into account, because, for example, if you have a dispatch center that maybe is a regional dispatch center for 5 or 6 or 7 different agencies, you are going to have an issue coming up with the appropriate policy and plan and procedures to get all the departments on board to say, hey, this is what we're going to do. Because every attorney obviously is going to have their own position on what's best for their client, and certainly there's going to have to be discussions. But you're going to have to work with a big group of people, and some of the people you're going to absolutely have to work with, and I want to point this out just from the front, is obviously you have your police chief, but you're going to have like your city council. And that is, by and large, I think the biggest sell, or whatever the governing board is over like the regional dispatch center or whatever the case may be. That is going to be something that needs to get addressed up front. And I have found that early, and over communicating with these people comes out with very, very positive results. And that is something that I think you need to make sure that you plan for upfront as you start going down this road, because there are good answers, but there's a lot of okay answers. So it's going to be decisions are going to be have to made about what type of risk you are willing to absorb as you go out and go ahead and go do this, right? And as a good segue, Amanda brought up the let me say it right here, the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. And as we were talking about this in the meetings with the dispatchers and trying to figure this out, my main concern was, how am I going to be able to legally defend or justify why we sent a call to a third-party provider like a Solari or Community Bridges or whatever the case may be, and what standard are we using? So if and when we do get sued, what are we looking at? What's our basis for doing this? And the Columbia scale was, after researching it and going through and looking at some of the studies that existed out there, was an established study that is used in the mental health community to determine somebody's ability or intent to harm themselves. And it was and the best part about it is I think there's some fluidity in there as well. So you're able to make these kind of determinations in these kind of gray areas where the dispatcher who may have some training on this, may not have a ton of training, but they may have some, can say, hey, this one's kind of like on the line. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to send not only the third-party provider, but I'm also going to send an officer as well too. And you kind of have like suspenders and a belt, which we like. That works out pretty well, generally speaking. But obviously, it also gives us a really good established process for when somebody does meet that criteria. Like, hey, we're dealing with somebody who has the ability, opportunity, and intent to do this to themselves or somebody else. Now that the game has changed, we have some good solid facts we can proceed on and move forward in there with law enforcement. So that was a big deal. And when we came up with that, that was kind of, I don't want to call it the linchpin of the program, but certainly was a very, very, very important part of our decision-making process and how we got to where we were at. Not to mention the policy changes, the appropriate policy changes that came with this, because this is also about the right butts in the right seats as much as it is about being able to do this right legally. It doesn't help if you have brand new rookie police officers going to these calls, and you have seasoned mental health people not going to these calls. So it's really important about who you're sending and who is available to go on these calls to get the outcome that we all want. So with that being said, I want to move into a couple of different things here with my remaining time. And one of the things I want to talk about, and this was kind of brought up already, and Amanda brought this up, with qualified immunity. And qualified immunity is essentially a legal concept that the law enforcement, the government agents conducting the activities, did not know that whatever conduct they engaged in was prohibited. I can boil qualified immunity down to you in one word, and that is notice. Did that government agency or government agent, when they're doing whatever it is they're doing, have notice that whatever they're doing is wrong? If the answer is yes, they had notice and they still did it, you don't get qualified immunity, which means you're going to be sued, and you're going to get sued successfully, very likely at that stage in the game. If there is no case on point and a reasonable police officer didn't know that they couldn't do that, very likely you will get what's called qualified immunity, which means you're immune from lawsuit in that particular circumstance, because there's no case that says, hey, you can't do this. And as we all know, these situations involving mental health are rapidly evolving, tense, and uncertain, and they're very dynamic, and they change all the time. So we can't expect people that are making these decisions when they're out there to make them with 100% precision and clarity, especially when they're under time compression and stress. So that is an important point. Now, the next thing, talking about qualified immunity, is state versus federal qualified immunity. Now, Amanda's brought up that some states have qualified immunity in their statute for going to serve things like mental health orders and all. That's fantastic. That's great. Qualified immunity at the state side is wonderful. It's not a bad thing. I believe Colorado might have actually gotten rid of their qualified immunity on the state side for law enforcement when they're dealing with these calls. So you kind of have both sides of the spectrum here. What is unique about government and lawsuits when the police specifically get sued, and typically the lawsuits are coming from a use of force in this particular case. Sometimes it's a death, other times it's a significant use of force where there's injury, but the person's going to survive and live. They get sued in federal court under 42 USC 1983. That's the kind of the standard bellwether for most plaintiffs' attorneys when they start suing folks, when they start suing law enforcement, and that puts you in federal court. That's where you start in there. So the dichotomy between state qualified immunity and federal qualified immunity is such that that's great if the state gives you qualified immunity, but the problem is the venue that you're getting sued under is in federal court. So part of the rationale behind why 42 USC 1983 gets used all the time is there's another section called 42 USC 1988, which essentially says if the plaintiff is minimally successful, like a $1 award, attorney's fees get paid by the city. And oftentimes the attorney's fees are far more than the damages that come out in those particular cases. So that's why we see a lot of this stuff in federal court. Qualified immunity in federal court, and we're in the Ninth Circuit out here in Arizona, so we get a lot of cases that deal with qualified immunity, especially in a mental health context, because we're dealing with, we obviously have California as part of the circuit, and they're just cranking stuff out left and right, and Arizona's not too far behind them. But we do have a lot of cases on there, and we can kind of see a bit of a trend where, and I can tell you from training officers on going out and looking at these calls, that less is more when they are looking at contacting people and using any type of force when they are trying to get somebody some mental health services, when the police have to get involved. So that's an interesting little tidbit right there too. But one of the things that we look at, and one of the things we're looking to kind of, I guess, prevent is what's the red herring? Like what's the real big minefield here of us falling into the trap, right? And a lot of things come down to, people like to talk about, what's our liability? Are we negligent, right? So let's talk about negligence just very briefly and at a very high level. Negligence essentially has 4 elements to it. There is a duty. That duty was breached. Because of that duty breach, something happened to this person we had a duty to, and then there's damages. So the real questions come down to what the damages are. Usually, minor damages like like a bruise or a bump aren't necessarily as attractive as damages that are more significant, broken limbs, things like that, surgery required types like that, right? So we have to have that for negligence. But the bigger issue on negligence is, what's the duty? And do you have the ability to not have to go? Because if you go back to your communities and you are talking to your fire departments, ask them how many calls they actually refuse to go to. And I think you will be surprised, because the fire departments refuse calls all the time. And law enforcement doesn't necessarily do that. You call the police, you're usually going to get an officer there, right? But when law enforcement picks up this duty, or when they pick up this call and they are now having to operate under some sort of standard of care, right, for the duty, because it's attached as we decided to go. And once we've gotten to that point, what is the standard of care that's universally accepted in the mental health community and dealing with somebody in crisis? And that's a really open question. That's why it's fantastic to have people like Amanda and Matt to rely on, and when you're trying to come up with these types of responses to these questions, because the best fight is the one you don't have to have. And if we have no duty to respond, why are we going? That's the conversations that kind of need to happen. And some people, some communities don't want to hear that. They want to hear, I'm going to call the police and want to go. So in your jurisdiction, you're going to have to turn around and take a real good look, a real hard look at what you want to do and how you want to get after it, because there is unique facets to all of this. And you are going to have to do, from the lawyer perspective, you are going to have to deal with different political views on it. You're going to have to deal with different city views on it. And most importantly, your resource base of what's available to you to get you to where you need to go. And that is really one of the bigger concerns, because different agencies have all kinds of different types of things available to them. You know, Mesa's got a helicopter. They have a lot of different specialized units to go deal with things. Rural, city, and middle America might not have those types of things to go deal with. And you need to work that out for you and try to figure out what is good and what's going to work. I see that I am running out of time here, so I will turn this over to Matt and have him pick it up from where I'm leaving off. So Matt.
Hey everybody, Matthew Moody. Excited to talk to you guys today. This is something that, when I look back at my career thus far, building this program has been one of the most rewarding parts of that. I started working in a crisis line in 2012, worked on the phones, and then, got to have this amazing experience. So I'm really happy to share this with you, and this is what I focus my time on now. Just a quick plug. If you guys are interested in this conversation, I was lucky enough to be accepted as a board member for CIT International, which is an organization that promotes collaboration between police and local crisis providers and mental health providers to provide the best care in our communities. And we have a conference coming up August 25th to 28th. If you want to check out citinternational.org, you can find out more there. Amanda and I will be presenting there as well on this program, so you could come and ask us questions. So at the time in 2018 that Amanda and Mesa approached what's now called Solari, it's a crisis line at that time. I was a freshly minted mental health, crisis line manager. And, this was a big new project for us at that time. There had been police collaboration, and there were a couple other programs in the country that were doing 911 like crisis line diversion. But the infrastructure in most of the country wasn't what it is here in Arizona at that point. So, our initial questions when it came in was, well, our first reaction was, yeah. Contact center managers and directors and stuff. Our first concern was call volume. So we were, it's in my networks and stable. Is it still coming through? Okay. Okay, it went away. I'll say this. Our initial concern was we're going to get flooded with calls and not be able to answer all of them. And then our other concern was, at 988, or at least in the crisis lines that I've worked with and worked on, our concern was always we're going to get transferred a call with someone that has already overdosed or is holding a weapon and is not consenting to care and doesn't want to operate with us, right? So that was always our concern. Those were always the scariest calls for us as 988 call takers and managers and so forth. So the first step that we took was to look at what kind of calls they wanted to send to us, and that's what we talked to Amanda about. And then we also kind of conversed with them about what kind of calls we can take. And in a lot of the work that I did where I was, doing training in these 911 centers, so I also helped start the Phoenix program that was referenced earlier today. There wasn't a strong understanding of what the other side did, right? So for 911, and I think for law enforcement in general, we as a society put the burden on them to solve mental health crises for all this time. And now we're trying to take some of that back and say, hey, we're going to get the right professionals here and help you guys out. But for, just understanding what we both did and were capable of doing was the first part of being successful. And that's where the policies and procedures came from. So we went back and forth multiple times on both sides. So it wasn't just creating a policy for 911 to transfer to crisis, but it was also our internal policies of how we handled calls that came in from 911 or from law enforcement, how we did risk assessments, and understanding which ones we would handle and when we would send calls back, like when should a call get sent back to 911. I know that's a big concern for a lot of law enforcement, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So once we had those policies in place, we started doing some diversion and saw some success, and I'll show you the graph in a minute to talk you through how the process happened and what we saw success with. But one thing that we really ran into was training had to be strong for the 911 call takers. They had to understand what types of calls they could send, but who they're actually sending it to. When you look at a 911 professional and they take a call, they can see where that person is. And if they need to, the 911 call taker can send an officer out and see that officer show up on a GPS screen. So that's tangible to them because 911 and police work so close together. They will know that that person got help. And some of the resistance we saw in some of the programs is people said, okay, previously to having the policy, I'm not sending anything without a policy because I'm not going to get fired or in trouble because there's not a policy telling me directly how to do this. And then the other thing is that 911 professionals really deeply care about the people that they're serving. They feel a personal liability, not like a legal liability. I'm going to get sued. They want to make sure that person survives, and they want to make sure that person gets good care. And so when you're asking someone to transfer from 911, a 911 professional to transfer a call to someone they do not know, they are going to be very concerned about that and have a lot of reticence to do that. So even if you have the policy, if they don't feel comfortable with who they're transferring to, they still won't do it because they don't want to go to bed that night and wonder if that person died, if they got the help they needed, et cetera. So lots of training was involved. There were lots of questions. And what I really learned was that there's two completely different cultures in 911 and 988. There's a lot of shared culture as well, like working an overnight shift on a Saturday night looks a lot like an overnight shift at a 911 center. But there's so many different ways of thinking. 911 is focused on establishing safety and getting a resource out to them as fast as possible. On 988, our goal is to build a collaborative relationship with somebody that's in a mental health emergency, and then getting information from them and helping them de-escalate. That's a whole different scope of care. And though we're all both there to help the person calling, it's just different ways and different goals. So once they started understanding that and understanding what types of calls they could send to us, that was really helpful. In Mesa, they call people under 18 that are not listening to parental commands or not going to school, something like that, an incorrigible juvenile. When I remember the first time that I told a 911 professional that we can take those types of calls, their eyes lit up, and it was a huge moment because they didn't recognize that was something that we could do. And when you're talking about a child that's having emotional outbursts or refusing to go to school and those sorts of things, a police officer is not trained in behavior modification, understanding developmental issues. They're not trained in that, and that could be a potentially traumatic experience to be mad at your parents, and then they bring in somebody with its authority and has a gun and a badge and potentially threatening you with going to juvenile detention or whatever. It's typically a better outcome if someone that's trained in mental health that works in a crisis line handles those calls. So that was a really magical moment where I started to understand the culture is different and that 911 and 988 need to understand each other's culture to be successful. So on top of training, one thing that we found out was really effective was doing ride-alongs, is what police call them a lot of times. But we would send somebody like supervisors or contact center staff from the crisis line over to 911 and have them just sit there for a couple hours and see what 911's like. And then we did vice versa with the 911 supervisors and some of their staff. And they could ask each other questions and see what this looks like in real life. And they began to trust it a whole lot more. So that was a really strong cornerstone and what was really helpful. So then we started looking at, we noticed that even though we changed the policy and the procedure and we did training, that there was a drop in calls when there wasn't somebody there that was reinforcing this, right? So we found out that having somebody from the crisis line in the center was really powerful at solidifying the trust that was involved and also building more confidence in what they could send over. And so when you hear about them talking about, the Phoenix program and the Mesa program and the clinician that sat in the center, that was actually me at the time, because I had gotten COVID in July of 2020, so right at the beginning of the thing. And then, we were on lockdown, so I was the only one that was able to go into the 911 centers where they, there's a lot of people next to each other. So I was the only one at the company that was able to go and do that safely. So I ended up spending about 1,500 hours in these centers and got to see how incredible 911 professionals are, and how similar in a lot of ways that 911 and 988 are. That was really formative in understanding this. So then we started looking at, having somebody in the center. And then, we'll show you in the graph in a minute what the benefit of that was. And it's very clear benefit. One thing when we talk about liability on both ends, for the 988 center, our goal was always to make sure that we're providing the best clinical care that we can and doing everything that we can to preserve life, right? Like that was our counseling code of ethics and social work code of ethics that we operated under. So that's what we were always focused on. And, one of the big concerns from 911 and law enforcement agencies is that they're going to get the call back. They want to send it somewhere and make sure that it's good and that they don't have to deal with it again. And that's something that I've found, pretty intensely caked into 911 and first responder culture. So that was important for us, is to make sure that we knew we were doing everything we could to resolve the call on our own with our resources and only sent it back if we had to. And we wanted to communicate very clearly in 911's terms, in their language, why this was coming back, why things changed. And so we found in like a good program, it's a 1% to 5% send back range. So if you send 100 calls to 988 from a 911 center, 1% to 5% is a good range of what should be going back. And what you're seeing there is that when you transfer somebody to the 988 line and they're taking more, 911 is typically a couple-minute phone call. When you're talking with us at 988, we're talking, between 20 and 40 minutes, up, hours. It can be a long time. And when you're talking to somebody that long and really connecting with them, they'll give you more information. And that's a really powerful situation. And so then when they revealed more to us, we would have to send it back. So that's what we're seeing a lot of times with these. So I just wanted to say that, you do want some calls going back. That is showing a healthy program. That is showing like good collaboration between the two agencies, and that there's trust happening. So you do want to see that, because people will reveal more to 988 in my experience they wouldn't necessarily with 911. So just to kind of wrap up the big lessons, and then I'll talk over the graph, specifically for liability, like the things that we saw was that having a strong collaborative relationship was really important. When we first started the programs, I had all the phone numbers for the 911 supervisors and managers at the agencies that we worked with. And, I was the director of operations at the time. So I was the guy that was already 24/7, 365. I was the one that was on call when something went wrong at the 988 center. So I already had that kind of, operation in my mind that I was operating at 24/7. So if there was an issue, they would text me and say, "Hey, what was this?" If they were concerned about it. And the fact that they trusted me enough to do that allowed us to solve a lot of problems, and had a lot of issues off at the past. So you really want to trust each other. You really want to enter into this relationship, understanding that. And, Amanda and I have become incredible friends, partially through this work, and I'm so grateful for it. Also, I just want to do a quick shout out. She actually retired on Tuesday. So she did 24 years and retired on Tuesday. So congratulations, Amanda. I just wanted to throw that out here. The second big lesson here is that policies and procedures on both sides have to be very clear. And you need to hold both call takers at the 911 center and the 988 center accountable. You need to say you didn't follow the procedure here. You really want to keep training them and keep coming back to that. At the end of the program, before I went to start, when I left the company, we were having the co-located 988 staff listening to a lot of phone calls that were transferred from the 911 center. So the person that was assigned to the Mesa co-location, they would listen to crisis phone calls after 911 had transferred them and make sure that they did a good job. And if they didn't, they would go to the supervisor at the crisis line and say, "Hey, I've heard this from this specialist. You might want them to check that out." And so we were constantly checking in to make sure we were doing a good job. And then Amanda really said it great, take baby steps. We are talking about changing a culture from 911 that's existed since 1968, right? 911 started in 1968 in Alabama. And they've grown a culture around that, and they really have been the people that we as a society have requested to save our lives for this whole time, and ask a lot from them over this. And we're now asking them to let go of a little bit and trust us with that. It takes some time to do that. And it takes some time for 988 folks to understand how to operate when 911 calls, and what that's like. Training on cop culture, 911 culture is very powerful as well. And that's something that I do when I go into a new center, 911 center, to do a diversion program. I really train them on, what does 988 look like? What are these people doing? And vice versa. I go to the 988 center and say, here's what police culture looks like. Here's how to interact with them. Here's why they're saying things in that way. And, you know, when you look, if you want to show the graph now with the, yep, that one. When you look at this, the collaboration, you know, did this, and every single one of these calls in my mind is a huge success, because that means that person's getting a better level of care for their mental health crisis. But then other ideas came from it, and we were just, you know, brainstorming one day, and they were like, what else could we do to do better in this? And I said, well, you know, if you guys wanted to fund some mobile teams through the Medicaid system that we already had here, through the crisis system, we could specifically dispatch them for just Mesa. And we got the response time down to 15 minutes in the downtown core area. I'm not aware of any other mobile team that was able to get there that fast, that consistently. They're doing 100 to 150 dispatches a month at this time, I believe. And so that wouldn't have happened. And now we've got police using even more mobile teams, which is great. In Arizona, when a mobile team comes out, they say, what's going on? Okay, we're safe. Officer, I'll see you later. And they take over the call. So it's another huge win there that came just from having the strong collaboration. So when we look at the graph that's on the screen right now, Amanda was correct in her timeline there. So in 2018, that's when these conversations started. And that first arrow there in 2019, it was October. So right where the arrow is October. And you can see that the calls actually started ramping up before then. Prior to then, and doing the training and the policy change, the only reason that they were transferring calls to us at crisis is, one, if the person called and specifically asked for that to be transferred to crisis, and two, we had and it still exists, a peer run warm line where people could call in and just get supportive listening and social support over the phone. So people would call. So those 5 calls-ish a month were basically people calling Mason 911 and saying, can you please transfer me to this other phone number? So once the policy change and the training happened, you can see there's a huge uptick. And you can, what I see here is that the uptick started before the go live. 911 was excited to do this. They knew that they weren't necessarily the best people for the job, and they were like, wow, we have another resource, and it's going to allow me to more efficiently help other people that are happening, or, you know, other people that are calling. It's incredible. So then you can see that up until 21, we saw a pretty consistent around 100 calls per month. And then that's when we kind of learned the lesson that having somebody face to face is helpful. So that's when I started going co-locating there at Mesa, right there in the middle of 2021, and you can see an increase happening from that. And then shortly thereafter, someone else took over as the clinician on site there. And then we updated the policies again. And so now you can see this pretty consistent average around 300 calls per month that are happening. The first policy just stated if they're suicidal, no means no plan, send them over. But then when we had those conversations about, you know, what else could we do? Well, you know, at 988, we take calls all the time where someone is suicidal with means and a plan, but no immediate intent to hurt themselves, right? And so we did a little bit of training with the 911 call takers and changed the policy and said, ask them if they have intent, or when is this plan? If they're planning on taking their life a year from now, then we have some time to work with that, and ask them if they want to talk to a mental health professional. Whereas in the past, it was just very much a conversation of, they're suicidal, I'm sending an officer out. They heard the word suicide, officer comes out. So we're starting to grow their understanding of mental health and how to help people with mental health conditions. We also changed the policy at the Mesa Police Department on the incorrigible juveniles. So juveniles refusing to go to school, kiddos not listening to their parents, having emotional outbursts. We changed that policy there. So now when you call Mesa, in most cases, they'll say, nope, this is not a police matter. This is a behavioral health. This is a social work issue. We're going to get you the people that specialize in that. And so now we don't have these police going out to calls they're not trained on and potentially going to have a bad outcome. They're just sending them over to the crisis line. So we're actually helping shift the culture in the community as well, and saying we're not doing this anymore. These are not police calls. These are mental health calls. So I'll leave it there. It's been an exciting ride. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak today. And if there's anything I can do to help any of you, let me know. And I will see you at the CIT conference. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We really appreciate you taking the time to show your support and share your expertise.